All right, hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel, and we tune you into great theories, concepts, and discoveries that you might not be familiar with. If you were, they would change your life in a good way. These are things that you might have to dig a little bit for, things that maybe have been suppressed, um, but that they are worth it to delve into. And this is another in our segments called Bible Decode. I think this is number 477, and this is where we look at things that your pastor, priest, rabbi, or minister probably doesn't want you to know about, and that they might strengthen your faith, might challenge your faith, might change your faith. And in particular, we have been looking at the psyop that is Christianity, that it was actually written by the Romans, the New Testament in full, and the Roman Caesars of the first century, and kind of as a long game, eventually all their descendants become the bishops of Rome and the popes, and turn it into the Roman Catholic Church. And they wrote the New Testament as a psychological operation against the Jews, who were um, very aggressive and zealous and resistant to Roman rule, and culminating in a war that lasted for 7 years, from 66 to 73 AD. The two new Roman emperors were actually veterans of that war and wounded in that war. And they recognized the power of the Jewish Messiah, who was, according to the Old Testament scriptures, uh, was to rise up and overthrow the uh, the Romans. And so instead, they came up with a Jesus Messiah, who was instead a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar, walking the extra mile, turning the other cheek, and at the same time being utterly critical of the Jews, overturning the tables of the money changers, castigating the uh, Jewish merchants selling animals for the sacrifice, uh, calling the Pharisees a den of vipers or generation of vipers, and urging his Jewish followers to abandon their families to follow him. And so, as you move further along in the New Testament, into the book of Acts and the epistles, then you get a character, Paul, who is even more deferential to the Romans and even more critical of the Jews. And so this should raise red flags with you already, but it doesn't. Um, and so that is why I bring it up. Now, we are looking at another book that is not specifically related to the Roman origins hypothesis, but is, on this, eh, eh, it does bring up those issues. And it's called Gospel Fictions by Randel Helms. And in this book, he looks over the, the four Gospels and just uh, looks at the kind of the psychology, what was in the minds of the gospel writers when they were writing their particular versions of various aspects of the gospel stories. How, Mark came first, and then Matthew and Luke. What was at stake for Matthew and Luke? How did they change Mark? And why did they change Mark, and what were the motivations, and what what was at stake, and what were the criteria. And it really turns out that the criteria are never historical accuracy. You know, that wasn't one of the things that they considered. They really considered, whether these stories make a seamless connection with the Old Testament stories, and uh, whether they, how they measured up to those Old Testament stories, and theological considerations. They want to portray Jesus in a way that they believed that he was, you know, um, and so he talks about the baptism story, and how the baptism was an embarrassment for Matthew. Mark's version of the baptism was an embarrassment for Matthew, because Mark, uh, had no virgin birth story. And so for Mark, the beginning of Jesus's ministry was the baptism. And that's why the the heavens opened after the baptism, and the dove comes down, and God says, "This is my son, for whom I'm well pleased." That is the beginning of Jesus' ministry for Mark. But for Matthew, the beginning of Jesus' ministry is day one, or before day one, where it's enunciated that Jesus is the Son of God, uh, you know, uh, before the virgin birth. And so, you know, at the point where it comes to the John the Baptist scene, Matthew is like, well, he doesn't even need to be baptized. He's sinless. He's already the Son of God. What this baptism scene is superfluous. And so, Matthew constructs uh, a dialogue where John says, "Oh, well, what are you coming to me to be baptized for? I should be getting baptized by you. I'm hardly able to hold your jockstrap, or your to lace up your sandals." you, you know um and Jesus is like, "Oh, well, just go through with it. It's just a formality. I understand. I don't need this, but I, I'm just going to go do it anyway, because it's kind of like a formality that we need to go through." And so none of this has anything to do with historical accuracy. you know Nobody was there. Nobody saw any of this happen. um that they're not being informed by anybody who saw this happen. They're just making it up. But they're making it up not for the purposes of specifically lying about it, but to portray the Jesus that they want to be portraying. Now, we're into chapter 4 here of this book, which is on miracles. And he's actually getting into another area having to do with water, the nature miracles. We talked about the feeding of the 5,000, and how that a lot of these miracle stories are patterned off the book of Kings, and the miracles of Elijah and Elisha. And so we'll see where they go here with the walking on water, and uh, calming the Sea of Galilee, which is really the Lake of Galilee. But here we go from chapter 4. Jesus also showed his power over nature in fictions about water. The ancients knew from Psalm 107 what power Yahweh has over the sea. At his command, the storm wind rose and lifted the waves high. carried up to heaven, plunged down to the depths, tossed to and fro in peril. They they reeled and staggered like drunken men, and their seamanship was all in vain. So they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he brought them out of their distress. The storm sank to a murmur, and the waves of the sea were still. They were glad then that all was calm, as he guided them to the harbor they desired. From this, I think that it was Psalm 107. From this famous and imaginative passage, we can trace the fruitful development of these separate fictional narratives, one of Jonah, two of Jesus. When the author of the book of Jonah was writing his story about the stilling of a storm, he consulted this psalm for details. In Jonah 1:4, the Lord sends a great storm and a high sea. In the psalm, at Yahweh's command, the storm wind rose and lifted the waves high. Jonah's sailors uh, rowed hard to put back to land, but in vain. And in the psalm, their seamanship was all in vain. In Jonah, the sailors called on the Lord and said, "O Lord, do not let us perish." In the psalm, uh, they cried to the Lord in their trouble. As a consequence, Jonah says, the sea stopped raging. The psalmist says the storm sank to a murmur, and the waves of the sea were stilled. In Jonah, the crew were filled with the fear of the Lord and offered sacrifice and made vows to him. In the psalm, those saved from the storm are advised to offer sacrifice of thanksgiving. Early Christians regarded the career of Jonah as a type, a prefiguring. And those are key words there. Those are really major criteria here for the composition of the Gospels. Whether you think it was written by the Romans or whether it was written by the evangelists, they're all using typology or prefiguration. Um, if you look at the beginning of the book of Matthew, the book of Matthew goes right back into the Old Testament story of Moses in Egypt, and the story of Jesus is a parallel or a type or the story of Moses is the prefiguring of Jesus's story. They've got to create a link or a connection with those Old Testament stories that gives it legitimacy or something. Um, this isn't exactly how we do these things today. We're more concerned with the historical accuracy or maybe other factors, but at this time, typology, prefiguration, these are major criteria. So early Christians regarded the career of Jonah as a type, a prefiguring of the career of Jesus. As Matthew puts it, Jesus's generation would be given the sign of the prophet Jonah. And again, there's a lot of fish imagery there too, Pisces imagery. Not so much the sign of Pisces in terms of February and March, but the age of Pisces, the precessional age of Pisces, which was basically we're wrapping up the age of Pisces right now and moving into the age of Aquarius. So the age of Pisces lasts for a little over 2,000 years from, this time, a little bit before, you know, the beginning of the Common Era up until now. And, processional ages go backwards through the zodiac. So, we were in Aries, and now here we're moving into Pi. And that's why a lot of the Old Testament imagery is about lambs and rams. And before that, it was about bulls. In the age of Taurus, then gave way to the age of Aries, then gave way to the age of Pisces, which was the two fishes, and that is part of the Jesus, age. But now we're moving into the water bearer, the age of Aquarius. Okay, so Jesus's generation would be given the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was in the sea monster's belly for 3 days and 3 nights, in the same way, and I had never even thought about that before. In the same way, the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the bowels of the earth. And that's Matthew 12:39. Now, the problem here is that no matter how you slice it, Jesus was in the tomb for 2 days and one night. He was it. He was in there for only for uh, or 2 nights in one day. Friday night, Saturday, and then he's risen early on Sunday morning. So that's not 3 days and 3 nights, um, or no matter how you slice it up. But that's kind of a technicality, and that is, something that's passed over all the time. But, there's no way that you can tell me that that's 3 days and 3 nights. Moreover, if the Lord stilled the sea in the case of Jonah, the same must happen in the case of Jesus. The account was written by Mark, who received it from a Greek. Now, I don't see any footnotes there. I could be wrong because my copy sometimes doesn't pick up everything. Uh, I'd like to know how he knows that the account was received from a Greek, other than it may be that it's from the Septuagint. Um, that's what he says. The account was written by Mark, who received it from a Greek speaking Christian tradition. Okay, from a Greek speaking Christian tradition, and did not seem aware of its source in the book of Jonah. In it, now Matthew is aware that it is coming from Jonah, but Mark apparently is not. In it, we find Jesus's disciples ferrying him across the Sea of Galilee to an open fishing boat. A heavy squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat until it was all but swamped. Now, from what I know, the lake of Galilee never gets that way. It's not a big enough sea to have those kind of waves that would be dangerous. But anyway, again, historical accuracy is not on the menu here. Now he was in the stern, asleep on a cushion. They roused him and said, "Master, we are perishing. Do you not care?" He awoke, rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Hush, be still." The wind dropped, and there was a dead calm. He said to them, "Why are you such cowards? Have you no faith even now?" They were awestruck and said to one another, "Who can this be? Even the wind and the sea obey him." And that's Mark 4:37 to 41. Either Mark or his source was aware of this story's relationship to the Psalms, if not to Jonah. For Jesus's rebuke of the sea is made in similar vocabulary, the word epitemesin in Greek. Um, and in Mark, the word is epitemes. Though we cannot be sure whether Mark regarded his story of the stilling of the storm as prefigured in the Old Testament, it is quite clear that Matthew did. For he rewrote Mark's account, deliberately changing its vocabulary to align it with the language of the Septuagint predictions. Matthew's first clue came from the statement in Mark that Jesus rebuked the sea. Familiar with the Septuagint Psalms, Matthew went, and again, the Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Hebrew, which was made in the early 3rd century BC, according to scholars, which I think is wrong, but um, regardless, um, it was a big deal because a lot of the Roman Empire spoke in Greek, including some people in Palestine. And so, and a lot of Jews living in Alexandria, Egypt, or in Rome, or in Antioch, Syria, you know, they were more Hellenized, they were more Greek speaking. And so, um, you know, the Septuagint had a big influence. Matthew went to the source of this remark and elaborated with it um, as as a guide, whereas Mark had written that the waves broke over the boat until it was all but swamped by the waves. Matthew, knowing that in the very psalm in which the Lord rebuked the Red Sea, the water covered the Egyptians, Matthew preferred to say that the boat was being covered by the waves as opposed to being swamped by the waves. And that word is kalyptosetho or something, as opposed to gemzethin. Um, by the waves. And just as the Lord's mighty acts were seen as wonders, Matthew in Matthew 8:27 used the same verb form to say that the disciples wondered at Jesus's acts. Matthew also knew, unlike Mark, that the stilling of the storm was based in part on the book of Jonah. For again, he rewrote his version of Mark's narrative based on chapter 1 of Jonah. So these are pretty small details that he's drawing on to kind of figure out that um, that Matthew is aware of the antecedents of the story, whereas Mark is getting them from somebody else. Um, so he rewrote his version of Mark's narrative based on chapter 1 of Jonah, read as foreshadowing the story of Jesus. Because Matthew was unhappy with the disciples' rude remark to Jesus in Mark, where they say, "We are perishing. Do you not care?" Matthew changed it uh, to into a prayer of faith. Save us, Lord. We are perishing. That seems like a bigger change to me. Um, Now, in the Septuagint, Jonah, the version used by Matthew, reveals the reason Matthew felt justified in changing Mark. Matthew recognized um, as a partial source of the disciples, we perish. The speech of the sailors in Jonah 1:14, forbid it, Lord, let us not perish. But Matthew also observed that the ship's captain says to Jonah, call upon thy God, that God may save us, and we perish not. Okay, so, you know, Matthew is, um, y- you know, changing it to, really link it up here with this Old Testament tradition in Jonah, in Psalms, and uh, while he is also, kind of changing the language from Mark that is a little bit sharper. We are perishing, do you not care? So um, that is kind of the psychology there of the stilling of the water. Now, uh, he never did get around to talking about the walking on water. It appears as if we're done with this chapter. Um, so maybe he doesn't include the walking on water episode in his chat. Oh, it may be in the next chapter because the next chapter is on the miracles in the book of John, and so we will get into that tomorrow when we return. And I would imagine that we'll be talking about walking on water when we get there. But that will do it for today. Thank you for tuning in. Like, share, subscribe, comment, contribute, and share with your Bible believing friends or otherwise. And come back tomorrow for another Bible Decode. Thanks for tuning in today. Have a great day.